Throughout U.S. history, LGBTQ+ people have faced violence and discrimination not just from their fellow Americans, but from our government as well, leading to a timeline of hiding in shame, silence, and suffering prejudice with little to no outcry. The earliest colonies made sure to criminalize sodomy, with punishments being as hard as death, most famously the Virginia and Connecticut colonies. The 1800s saw extreme backlash against the first American publications with queer characters and plotlines, as well as the term crime against humanity, first used in the U.S. Criminal Code in part against homosexuals. Cross-dressing was seen worthy of imprisonment and corporal punishment. Tighter and tighter restrictions were placed on the putative perverts, so called by the federal and state governments. However, after hundreds of years of phobia and hatred, change in the U.S. started coming after the turn of the 20th century. Known as the gay rights movement, but involving all LGBTQ people, a fight by the queer community for the queer community evolved to say, "We are fed up." And queer people across the nation began standing up to fight for their rights as Americans. Police raids on known gay hangout spots and establishments for homosexual camaraderie were common, making the few places where it's safe to be gay as dangerous for them as it was anywhere else. Unsurprisingly, queer Americans were getting tired of this ever-looming risk of violence and arrest. In 1969, in the early hours of the morning on June 28th, there was a police raid on the Stonewall Inn. The bar owners would turn on the lights to signal everyone to stop dancing or touching, and they always kept more alcohol in a hidden cupboard to keep drinks up if police confiscated what was in the open. Police would line up patrons and look for identification cards. For those who without identification or in full drag were arrested, the Mafia family owned the bar and would usually get a tip-off from a source if a raid were to happen. But on June 28th, they heard nothing. When police barged in, many were confused, and those who knew what was happening ran to escape and refused to comply with the officers blocking the doors. Some were arrested, but the police car was late to pick them up. Those who were not arrested went outside to watch, and a crowd began to grow. Police were violent to the crowd, which led to an escalation to vandalism and further riots. Trans activist Marsha P. Johnson threw the first object that further fanned the flames of rebellion. Many riots were organized after that night, and tensions were high in New York City and the LGBT communities all around the U.S.
Groups formed. There were further protests over the next few years, the likes of which I think we've never seen, even since then. And there was a spread out of the cities into all regions of the country. So on a certain level, it's what happened after the riots that really explains why it is that we're still talking about the Stonewall riots almost 50 years later.
The results of the Stonewall riots were a huge boom in visibility for the queer community, leading to civil rights meetings between New York's LGBT circles, which led to the formation of various advocacy groups, such as the Gay Liberation Front. On the first anniversary of the Stonewall riots, the first gay pride parades in U.S. history took place in Los Angeles, Chicago, San Francisco, and near the Stonewall Inn in New York.
The Stonewall riots inspired LGBT people throughout the country to organize in support of gay rights, and within 2 years after the riots, gay right groups had been started in nearly every major city in the United States. Politically, Stonewall led to more action towards those discriminated against in courts and government legislature, such as the Matashi Society Sip-In, a queer protest against bars that led to the removal of a discriminatory legislator. Harvey Milk was the first openly gay person to be elected to political office in California. During his time on the San Francisco County Board of Supervisors, Milk was a major advocate for more LGBT rights and used his influence to urge the passing of the Gay Rights Ordinance in 1978 that protected queers from being fired from their jobs.
It's needed. If every gay person in this state came out to their family, their friends, we would win. But that means that every gay person must come out to their family so their family doesn't vote against them, to their friends if they are indeed their friends, to their relatives, to the people where they work, and to the next door neighbors, nobody else. If that happened across the state, we win. If not, it's going to be a tight battle.
Milk was an advocate for larger and less expensive child care facilities, free public transportation, the development of a board of citizens to oversee the police, and even a bill to require dog owners to pick up after their dogs. Dan White, Milk's assassin, proposed that a mental health facility should not be placed in Castro, the district where he lives. Milk initially agreed, though after he learned more about the facility, he decided to switch his vote, ensuring White's loss on the issue. White did not forget it. He opposed every single initiative and issue Milk supported. On November 10, 1978, Dan White resigned from office, yet within a few days he asked Mayor Moscone for his position back. While the mayor first agreed, he later on found someone more suited to his place. White then snuck into the city hall through a basement window and went to Moscone's office, where White shot him 4 times. White then intercepted Milk and shot him 5 times. White's trial was inconceivable, as the seated jury for White's trial consisted of white, middle-class San Franciscans who were mostly Catholic. Gays and ethnic minorities were excluded from the jury pool, and White's lawyers used diminished capacity. Specifically, that White had binged on junk food earlier, resulting in a diminished mental state. White was found guilty of only manslaughter of the 2 victims and was sentenced to 7 years, though released at 5 due to good behavior. This conviction caused major outcry within the gay community as it led to the White Riots, where gays formed a huge mob and protested. Harvey Milk's assassination changed California's political and judicial system. In 1980, San Francisco ended district supervisor elections, seeing that a board of supervisors so diverse would be harmful to a city. A grassroots neighborhood effort to restore district elections in the mid-1990s proved successful, and the city returned to a neighborhood representatives in 2000. Though majorly, as a result of Dan White's trial, California voters changed the law to reduce the likelihood of acquittals of the accused who knew what they were doing, but claimed their capacity was impaired. Diminished capacity was also abolished as a defense, and the Twinkie defense has entered American mythology, forever known as the case where a murderer escapes punishment because he binged on junk food. Similar to the Twinkie defense is the gay/trans panic defense. Queer people through history often face an unfair justice system. They would be charged for disorderly conduct at random, and when they were the victims of crimes, police would be slow to act. The gay/trans panic defense is when lawyers would defend their clients, saying that the victim of the crime made unwanted advances or did not share their biological sex with the assailant. Such is the case of the murder of James Burley. Burley invited a drunk high Robert James Thornton to his room to watch television, and after Burley tried to make advances, Thornton stabbed him to death. Thornton was charged only 10 years in prison due to his lawyer using the gay panic defense. An example of the trans panic defense is the murder of Gwen Arahu. After attempting sexual advances by the assailants and the victim, Arahu was subjected to forced genital exposure in the bathroom, after which it was announced that he really was a man. The defendants claimed that Arahu's failure to disclose her biological sex was deception and led to their attack on her. 2 of them were charged with second-degree manslaughter, and the other with voluntary manslaughter, and the jury failed to return the requested hate crime additions. The only state where these defenses is illegal is California. Even then, the banning of it was only a few years ago in 2014. It is hopeful that other states will follow as well, but with the current political climate, some waiting might be mandatory. These cases are slowly moving to the justice system to be more fair in dealing with these instances of hate crimes.
On so many levels, the US government seemed willing to overlook the needs of its proud, everyday American citizens if they were part of the LGBTQ community, whether they needed anti-discrimination legislation, the promise of punishment for violent bigots, or even basic health care. And that brings us to the AIDS crisis. Though anyone could have gotten HIV and then AIDS, it was far more common among gay and bisexual men. The HIV virus spread rapidly through the US in the 1980s, killing tens of thousands after long, painful battles with AIDS. At one point, the statistics were that an AIDS death occurred in the US every 30 minutes. Despite the rapidly climbing death tolls, the government under President Reagan and his administration turned a blind eye to victims of the syndrome, some even thinking it was God's way of punishing homosexuals. Fueled by the homophobic and growing religious right and moral majority, the federal government failed to set up special clinics or hospitals, provided no funding for AIDS research, even deflected questions on the issue with chillingly unfeeling jokes. Referenced by some as a deliberate gay genocide, the AIDS crisis needed to be addressed, and if no one would fight for the community, they would have to do it themselves. They began to band together to fight for access to healthcare in a country where the government didn't care about them, and against homophobic, defaming, often inaccurate statements put forth by the fear-mongering media that furthered high-risk discrimination, even in hospitals. Marches to government offices wound up with queer activists being beaten and arrested while attempting to make their voices heard to those in power. Forming organizations like ACT UP and GLAAD, the protesters asserted that universal healthcare was a right, not a privilege reserved for those who were straight and white.
The radical part of the AIDS movement, along with the what I think of as the more reformist part of the AIDS activism, succeeded in quickening the release of drugs, changing the way diagnoses happen, because some of the way AIDS was diagnosed favored the symptoms that were most common in white gay men, but not the symptoms that were more common in women and people of color. So ACT UP succeeded there, succeeded in addressing discrimination by the health insurance industry, speeded up trials, and then ultimately, I think largely thanks to their work, along with allies in government and industry, by the early 1990s, there were finally effective treatments.
Under the guise of being a protection for gay Americans after the murder of Private First Class Barry Winchell, as it also prohibits the harassment of closeted homosexuals, the Clinton administration in 1994 instituted Don't Ask, Don't Tell, a policy banning out gay men and lesbians from serving in the U.S. military. As the name implies, a serviceman was not to be asked their sexual orientation, nor were they supposed to tell anyone if that orientation wasn't heterosexual. In all, 13,650 people were discharged from the military under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. The outcry and response was huge. America preaching love, equality, and justice, but then contradicting that message by prohibiting gays from serving in its military created a sort of cognitive dissonance. Not to mention the policy was forced on the military leadership to implement. Many military leaders didn't agree with it, but president after president kept it in place, and enforcement of the policy was followed, though resented. Support for the policy faded further away with each passing year, as less and less military leaders, though still fully enforcing it, agreed with the idea. It was reported that at least $95.4 million in recruiting costs and $95.1 billion for training replacements for the 9,488 troops discharged from 1994 through 2003. In addition, calls by the queer rights movement for the end of Don't Ask, Don't Tell was becoming increasingly restless with every succeeding president. The Right to Serve campaign was created by Soul Force in 2006 to enlist gays and lesbians into the Army and Navy. Speaking tours by gay former service members were organized to gain more traction for the movement for the repeal. Once the repeal finally came about, all three forms of tension were eased. Once overturned by President Obama in 2011, Don't Ask, Don't Tell's discharge proceedings that were in process were dropped, high-ranking servicemen came out, and many who were discharged returned to duty. This is an example of the queer rights movement getting America more in line with its own values, getting the military to run smoother and with less unnecessary expense, adjusting policies to make citizens more free, more equal, and scrapping policies that stop gay people from living as they were.
Pressure on the U.S. government to assist the queer population extended outside the nation in 2017, in response to reports that the government of Chechnya was and is kidnapping, torturing, and killing LGBTQ Chechens. From what we know to date, they're being interned into concentration camps. Victims who had fled and hid in Russia disclosed that they were detained in a room, about 30 to 40 people per one room. Every day they'd be humiliated, tortured with electricity, and heavily beaten, sometimes to death. Then the bodies would be hidden, making the total death toll unclear. The Chechen government not only denies this, but asserts that there are no gays in Chechnya to arrest at all. Other countries like Germany and France have recently taken in their first refugees from this danger. Avea Jan Jacobsen, Secretary of the European Parliament's Intergroup on LGBT Rights, has urged more developed nations to do the same, and the Human Rights Campaign is urging the Secretary of State to take action as well. Yet the U.S. hasn't said they have any intention to take Chechen refugees. While the U.S. has released statements condemning the situation, there are still crickets about actual action. Perhaps this is because of a fundamental flaw in international asylum practices, brought to light by queer activists in the U.S. If a Chechen fleeing persecution were to go to the U.S. Embassy in Moscow for help, they would be turned away.
Though the United States has signed conventions binding them to assist those facing persecution, it applies only to the asylum seekers already on American soil, providing no obligation to aid victims trapped in their home countries by visa applications. This is the case, but this hesitant, inactive mentality seems unaligned with proclaimed American values.
I would hope that in the long term, right, the United States will apply to LGBT people to some of the same criteria that they apply to other groups, which is that if someone is experiencing a genuine threat of violence, intimidation, discrimination in their home countries, on the basis of things like race, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, religion, then I think it's in the best of U.S. values to provide options.
Though it hasn't yet swayed the government into taking action, or the president into even speaking on the issue, awareness of this issue would be nil or close to it in the US if we didn't have LGBTQ activists. LGBTQ rights are human rights, and in this case, the LGBTQ movement in our nation is insisting on human rights being the inherent core of US foreign policy. Though the situation is recent and not yet resolved, queer activists are making it clear that helping our fellow human beings by sheltering them from persecution is the right thing to do, hopefully leading to helpful legislation in the near future. Arguably the most cited and celebrated accomplishment of the LGBT rights movement was the recent legalization of same-sex marriage in 2015, a feat that, without the queer rights movement, would never have been possible. It is because of the unceasing immense stimulus from the queer community that we moved from civil partnerships in some states to legally recognized marriages in some states, and then finally granting that right nationwide. This legislation passed was fully a result of decades upon decades of Americans fighting for their rights. The rights movement is a little talked about and yet widely important part of American history. Without queer activism, we'd have more holes in our judicial system, less people aware of related human rights violations in other countries, less protection for millions of Americans who would then also be unable to serve in the military or marry someone they love. A response to hate, bigotry, and violence, the beautiful movement's messages have been about love, justice, and compassion, American values that should be upheld. We were and are concerned with more than our own specific issues. We want the U.S. government to uphold its promises to all Americans. Queer activism has not only benefited the LGBTQ community, but America as a whole, bettering the nation and bringing its issues to light one step at a time.
I think like race-based movements, like the women's movement, like a lot of other movements in U.S. history, the LGBT movement has really promoted fundamental American values like democracy, diversity, fairness, equality, and justice. And all the things we've been talking about really are part of those struggles. Some working within the U.S. political system, some trying to kind of extend U.S. Political ideologies to actually be even more ambitious and more aspirational. And I think rather than seeing this as a top-down process where it's a political leader, a president, a governor, an elected official who grants reforms, it's grassroots social movements that mobilize people, that bring people together, that force elites, political elites, cultural elites, economical elites to change their policies and practices. So the LGBT movement is just in that tradition of a grassroots mobilized movement that has succeeded in, has failed in many respects. There's still a lot of work to be done, but in other respects has really succeeding in changing the United States for the better.